Hello everyone, and welcome to the 12th video of the TypeScript Engine tutorial series. In this video I'm going to address something a little bit different, and that is the ability to work on a different platform and be able to develop this and follow along on Linux as I'm actually running here. Very similar steps will be needed for Mac, but I'm actually not going to go into those in this video because I don't have a Mac. There's a few things that we need to make sure that are installed on your Linux environment. The first thing is you need to make sure that you install the Node Package Manager, or NPM. It is not installed by default, so you need to make sure that you have that installed. You'll also need Git installed. You will also need a HTTP server installed, and that's a Node package. So real quickly, in a terminal, the way that you would install that is sudo npm install http server -g. So that will install it globally so that it's accessible from anywhere, and it will allow us to run a web server locally and be able to execute our application without having to upload it somewhere. The other thing that you're going to need is Visual Studio Code, and this is not necessarily a requirement, but it's what I'm going to be using in this tutorial. And the reason for this is because Visual Studio Code is actually very much geared towards TypeScript. It's got a lot of excellent TypeScript tools, and it provides some nice integrated type of features in order to enhance the TypeScript development experience. So feel free to use whatever editor that you want. When we actually go to compile, I'll show you how to do that from the command line so that you don't have to worry about that. Speaking of which, you'll also need to make sure that you have TypeScript installed so that TSC, the TypeScript compiler, will work. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that we're going to have to do, obviously, is clone the repository. So in order to do that, I've created in my home directory a development/git folder. And so I've browsed to that in a terminal, and I'm going to say git clone https github.com/Travis Vroman /ts-engine-tutorial, and then hit enter. And so now we have the project pulled down to disk. So let's go ahead and close that terminal window. So if we look here in our file browser, we have our base folder with the solution. So we're actually not going to be using the solution file because that's Visual Studio specific. So we're going to need to do some setup to actually get this to work with code instead. And the nice part about this is it'll actually allow us to work both in code or Visual Studio if you happen to be flipping back and forth between platforms like I'm going to be doing. This will work for both of those things. So in order to do this, what we need to do is first start up code. So now we have Visual Studio Code. We're going to go over here to the Explorer, and we'll see that we do not yet have a folder opened, so we're going to click Open Folder. And in my case, I've already browsed to Development Git TS Engine Tutorial, and that's the folder I actually want to use. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And as you can see, it's loaded up all of our files for us and has them all nicely available there. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is in Visual Studio Code, we're going to want to right-click the TS Engine folder, and we're going to say New File. And we're going to call this tsconfig.json. And this is going to be the file that is going to serve as the instruction set for the TypeScript compiler. It's going to tell the TypeScript compiler exactly what we need it to do. So I'm not actually going to code this from scratch. I've actually got a sample of this file that exists. So I'm just going to paste some code in here and explain what's going on here. So we have our compiler options, which is one of the main things that it looks at. The module that we want to use, this is the JavaScript module that is used in terms of how the actual module generation occurs. So the one that we want to use is AMD, because that's one of the two that supports output to one JavaScript file, which is ultimately what we want. This option right here basically provides us with a warning anytime that we use a implicit any. So in other words, if we have a method that doesn't provide a return type, it'll throw a warning for that. So we'll leave that on. Remove comments is basically when we compile our code, it strips the comments out from the JavaScript that is generated. Preserve const enums. I really don't want to go into what that is right now, but let's just take it at face value and say that let's just leave that set as is. The next bit is this out file, and this is one of the more important options. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to output our JavaScript file to a build. Actually, I don't want that in the build folder. We're going to output our JavaScript to main.js. And so inside our TS engine, you'll see here that we already have main.js because this has actually been checked into the repository. I've got to fix that. We shouldn't be checking these things in, so that's actually something I'm going to fix in this video as well. Anyway, source map is what generates this main.js.map, and then target is going to be ECMAScript 5 because getters require ECMAScript files, so if you don't actually define this, then you're going to get errors when we go to compile. The next thing is we want to include, and we're basically saying that we want to include all TypeScript files in all folders. And then we want to exclude, which we're basically saying that we want to exclude anything in the node modules folder, which we don't actually have, but if we were to install any node packages, they would show up in that folder. So we're saying we don't want to check those things in, or we don't want to, we don't want to compile those things when we're actually running the compilation. We want to ignore those files. And we also want to ignore any files in any folder that end in .spec.ts. And again, I'm not really going to go into that, but that has to do with npm as well. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. The next thing I'm going to do is go to extensions. And we need to make sure that debugger for Chrome is installed. If you don't have this installed, it is a nice, convenient way to be able to debug and launch directly to Chrome as you would do in the full version of Visual Studio. Okay, so now that we've got our tsconfig defined, what we need to do is actually compile it. And to prove that this works, I'm actually going to delete the JavaScript files and the JavaScript file and the JavaScript map file. And I'm going to open in terminal that folder, and I'm just going to type in tsc, which is the TypeScript compiler. And if you get no output like this, then that means it was successful. If there are errors, they'll list out there right in the terminal. So what you may have noticed that happened in the background here is we actually have our main.js and our main.js map. So if I actually open this guy up, you'll see the generated JavaScript code here. So all of our code has now successfully compiled, which is awesome. And so now that we've done that, we can actually go ahead and run it. However, before we run it, we need to actually start up a local web server, and I alluded to this before. So what we actually need to do is, with the terminal window selected, we need to go up here to terminal and say new tab, because we need a new terminal instance for this. And we want to type http server-o. This was that npm package that we installed globally before. And so what this is going to do is it's going to spin up a web server, and here we go. Here is our application running in the browser on our local server. And the reason that we want this in a new tab is because this terminal instance is going to be occupied running that server until we hit Control-C to stop it. So we're not going to be able to compile. However, if we go back to this instance of the terminal, we can type tsc again, compile again. and refresh, and we're good to go. So let's close that. And now that we've actually closed our browser, in fact, I'm gonna close the browser completely. Now that we've done that, you might be wondering how we actually start that browser back up if we actually closed it. So what we're going to do is, the main way we're going to work is we're going to say debug and then start debugging. And it's going to ask us to select an environment. And what we actually want to do is we want to hit Chrome. And that will actually create this launch.json file. And you'll note that the launch.json is added to the VS Code in here. And so what this file does is it defines some parameters for Visual Studio Code to actually launch our application when we use that debug option. And so it actually gives us, under debug, it gives us that as an option. And so when we run it, we get localhost 8080. And so, whoops. And so we actually don't need to change anything. The default configuration for this is perfectly fine. So we can just leave that as is. And you'll note here that we have one option here now, launch Chrome against localhost. So one other thing that I would like to point out is I also have a debugger for Firefox installed. And again, you can just search in extensions debugger for Firefox and go ahead and install that. And that will allow you to use Firefox if you want to use that instead. And so the way that you would set that up is in your launch.json, you can click this add configuration button, and that will add Firefox here. So we can just say Firefox launch server is the option we want. And we could just say launch with Firefox. And I'm going to change this URL to match the other one, so it's going to just be port 8080, so localhost port 8080. And I'm actually going to say, make these consistent. So launch with Chrome, launch with Firefox. Go ahead and save that. And then if we go back to our debug here, you'll see that we have a launch with Firefox and a launch with Chrome. So I can actually launch now with Firefox if I wanted to test with Firefox. And I can launch with Chrome when I want to test with Chrome. So that is really all that is needed in terms of getting this to run on a Linux environment. There's not a whole lot to it, but there is some setup, and if you're not familiar with how to do these things, it can be a little daunting to try and figure out. The next thing that I actually want to do is I want to go ahead and put in a couple of fixes that were mentioned. So let me just go here to the Explorer. So one of our more astute viewers actually noted in GL Buffer that the unbind method was actually incorrect. So in bind, we're calling gl.bindBuffer, and we're passing this .target buffer type, and then this .buffer. But here we're actually explicitly saying GL array buffer as the buffer type, and then this .buffer. And this is actually completely wrong. So what this really should say is we want to say this .buffer type, target buffer type, and in the second one we don't want to pass this buffer, we actually want to say undefined, because we don't want to, basically what we're saying is we want to unbind by binding to nothing. And so we want to make sure that we unbind the correct buffer type, and that we unbind by not actually binding to any buffer at all whatsoever. So let's go ahead and debug that, just make sure it works, and it does. Perfect. Okay. Okay, so the next thing that I actually need to fix is I need to make sure that these main.js and main.js.map files do not get checked in. And so, just to explain this a little bit, so anytime you're generating JavaScript files, which is the output of TypeScript, we don't actually want to be checking that in to the repository. And the same applies for the main.js map file. So we actually don't want to be checking those things in, and they have been getting checked in. And so what we need to do is we need to git ignore them. And so if we go to source control here, we can actually right-click the main.js file and say add file to git ignore. Okay, and in the git ignore, you'll note that it's actually been added down here at the bottom. Now, I don't want to add this specifically file by file, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add this sort of globally, if you will, for all JavaScript files. So we want to ignore generated JavaScript files. And we actually want to say star.js. And we're also going to add another entry on a new line, and we're going to say star.map.js. Okay? And I believe that should be it. Let me just double check. So I don't believe the DTSs are actually being checked in, which is what we want. Okay, so I'm guessing that's already in here somewhere. I'm actually just going to explicitly add it anyways. So I don't want to include any TypeScript I don't want to include any generated TypeScript definition files. Okay. So I'll add that to the git ignore as well. Okay, so that is pretty much everything that we should need to do. So I'm actually just going to, this time around, I'm actually just going to go ahead and commit here. I'm going to say lesson 12. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and commit that. And, whoops, I forgot to stage the changes. Okay, yes, commit them automatically. Okay. Okay, so I actually want to use the command line because I'm more familiar with that. And so I'm going to say git add star, and then I'm going to say git commit message lesson 12, and then I'm going to say git push. Okay. Let me just log in. Great. So now it's pushed, and I'll refresh this, and they're still there. Oh, I know what I did. Okay. I need to actually delete those two. Okay. So git add star, git commit, removing JS and JS map files, and git push. There, that should do it. Okay, perfect. So now those JavaScript files won't be present any longer. Okay, so that is actually going to do it for this video. I wanted to keep this kind of short and sweet. So let me know what you guys think. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned. I hope this helps all of you guys out there who aren't on Windows and can't use Visual Studio or don't want to use Visual Studio. This is an alternate way of developing, which I think works quite well. So yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I will see you guys next time.